Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Monga. My team is responsible for detecting internal and external threats which can harm our members' data along with our intellectual property. I'm serving as CISO at Virtually Testing Foundation. We have red, blue teams, SOC analysts, and threat hunters. We love to hunt, honestly, just love to threat hunt. Because of that, we partner with the US government on various projects such as digital forensics, malware detection, and offensive security. Our friends at three-letter agencies partner with us on bringing the cybersecurity workforce gap really short and hopefully remove it eventually. At VTF, our mission is to offer cybersecurity and non-technical career paths. Today, with me, I brought the prestigious and highly ranked US government officials, and they know zero trust and minor attack framework better than me. So, why zero trust today? In 2012, when we at Virtue Testing started looking at what do we need to do as far as goes to the change of strategy, and quoting my friend John Kinderbark here, the hallmark of zero trust is simplicity. We wanted to make things complex because we wanted to do security, but on the name of security, we were making things way too complicated. So we started looking at the journey where how do we make things simpler? How do we make things so simpler that we can start having the mindset of zero trust? It's not a product, it's not a solution, it's not a blinky box that you can buy it and we can achieve zero trust. It's a mindset, it's a living journey. With that, today, we also want to talk about a MITRE attack framework. And that again, after 2015, we wanted to start looking at what other the APT groups that actually uses that actually come in with all the stages of the kill chain and exfil the data, that intellectual property, the crown jewels that we are trying to protect. So combining those two together, zero trust and MITRE attack framework, this conversation is going to be very helpful. This conversation is also going to be very helpful for those who are serving the US government or actually contractor with the US government. With that, I'm going to pass it on to my good friend, Jonathan Reber.
Hey, great. Thanks, Victor. Really appreciate it. So my name is Jonathan Reiber. I'm the Vice President for Cybersecurity Strategy and Policy at ATT&CK. We are the industry's leading breach and attack simulation provider for automated security control validation. And we leverage the MITRE attack framework to conduct automated testing at scale in production and against multiple threats to validate your defense effectiveness. Um, I'm also a national security professional. I spent 8 years in the Pentagon, including as a speechwriter and chief strategy officer for cyber policy, where I wrote the first and second national cyber defense strategies of the United States, um, under the leadership in the latter part of Major General John Davis, who I am extremely pleased to have join us here today. Hello, John.
Hey, Jonathan.
John Davis, he's so humble that you would never know that he's jumped out of more airplanes than there are years in the history of the United States, as a special operations leader in the U.S. Army. He's the vice president today. Well, today he's the vice president for the public sector at Palo Alto Networks, where he expands cybersecurity initiatives in every facet of the industry and does global public policy with the international public sector around the world, helping governments and organizations, but really right now, mostly governments all over the world, to better defend themselves against cyber attack. And there's really no one more qualified for that. He was the senior military advisor for cyber for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy when we served together, and he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy Acting, when we were in the Defense Department from 2012 to 2015. And he held a lot of leadership positions in special operations, cyber, and information operations, including at the beginning of U.S. Cyber Command, working with General Keith Alexander many years ago. He's got a master's in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College, a master of military art and science from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and a bachelor's from this university in upstate New York you may have heard of called West Point. So, John, thank you for joining us, and it's great to see you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And it's great to see you, my friend. And thanks also to Victor for inviting me to join you today. With an introduction like that, Jonathan, I'm not sure there's much left for me to say about myself, other than that it's been a real pleasure after serving 35 years in the military. It's been a real pleasure to be at Palo Alto Networks for the past 7 years And basically, what I do is try to help leaders and other organizations, both in the public sector as well as in the commercial sector, solve their toughest challenges when it comes to cybersecurity. And I'm honored to join you here today for what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion.
With that, I guess I can pose the first question to both of you. What changes have we seen in the cyber threats as well as in our cybersecurity posture in the time since you both have served in Pentagon between 2012 and 15?
We always have liked to say that the cyber threat has been a growing concern to those involved in national security for a long time now. And I think that's still true. I think it's getting more sophisticated, getting more automated, leveraging more advanced analytics as both nation states and non-nation state types of threats. But I think today it's gone into not just national security, but economic stability and even public health and safety concerns on a grand scale. When you look at things like ransomware, for example. Um, I mean, we're all familiar with some of the biggest cyber threats that we face today as a global society, ransomware being one of them, but also industrial control system attacks, which impact our critical infrastructure. There are all kinds of vulnerabilities that continue to be exploited for various purposes. And even supply chain has become a kind of the one of the topmost cyber threats or cyber related threats that we've been dealing with for some time now. And you take a look at an event like SolarWinds. That was a very sophisticated supply chain type attack in terms of how it began. And and if you look at Palo Alto Network's threat intelligence organization, Unit 42, they'll tell you that still the biggest challenge that we see in the world today is business email compromise, one of the top threat vectors that our teams deal with on a daily basis. So all these threats are, they continue to be important. The scale and the speed at which they operate, I think, continues to cause significant challenges for all of us, whether you're talking from a personal perspective, a business perspective, or you're involved in government functions.
Email is the sort of tried and true method that keeps being used. It's cheap and cheerful and a way for intruders to break in over and over and over again. It's interesting. When we think about John and I have been doing this now long enough that we can put on our historian hat with some ease. And one of the points that I like to raise for listeners and viewers is the internet is the exact same age as Chris Hemsworth and Nicki Minaj, which should give you some sense of its maturity, right? It went from 0 to 5 billion users in just over 40 years, right? Which is a tremendous transformation in space and time. So if you look at so John and I stopped working in the Pentagon together in 2015, right? And that's sort of a pre-watershed year in cybersecurity history. At that point, you had Russia using Ukraine as a test bed for some of the destructive operations that have galvanized world attention, right? Like they shut off parts of the electric grid in Kyiv in 2015 and 2016. But that was sort of, I don't know if it was an intentional distraction for the malicious operations that they were designing against the weak underbelly of our social media. But at least when I was working with John and others on the cyber defense strategy of 2015, I was much more focused on sort of hard cybersecurity attacks. Meanwhile, the Russian intelligence services were exploiting our weak underbelly through social media and sowing the kind of distrust and really easy to put their hands on the button of internal discord in the US through a hack leak scenario by stealing data and then exploiting it through memes. So it was like I think that was a galvanizing moment in this country's confrontation with cybersecurity, where all of a sudden my aunts and uncles, previously they would call me if they were asking about their router, but then they started calling me asking about like what Russia was doing. And I think over the last 7 years, that's certainly been, as John indicated, Russia's been a driving force, including with ransomware, right? Like ransomware groups, ransomware as a service, targeting everybody from hospitals to municipalities to then the Colonial Pipeline attack, which was the first sort of physical and economic impact that we'd really seen.
Hey, Jonathan, if I could just add on to that very briefly, I think you're absolutely right. and I mentioned nation states and non-nation states before, and one of the big trends that I think we're seeing nowadays is the blurring of the lines between them. If you look at adversarial nations to most of the Western democracies, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, you're seeing an increasing use in third-party actors and organizations to include criminal organizations, surrogates, patriotic hackers that are in some cases inspired by nation states, and in other cases covertly directed by and given resources by nation states. So I think that's a trend that we're seeing, that an alarming trend that we're seeing. And I also couldn't agree more with you that if you look at those same four adversary nations and look at what they're doing in what we call the gray space, short of the traditional trigger for use of armed force, or what you might call traditional warfare, I think they really don't want to fight in the traditional space. They know they would lose at great cost. And so I think they're leveraging these, what I'll call information warfare capabilities, to include cyber, one of the most prolific tools in the information warfare kit bag, to stay in that gray zone and frustrate Western democratic responses by doing things that you're talking about, including leveraging the use of both traditional and social media in order to create an advantage for them. And I don't know if this is an existential problem. I personally think that we should consider that, but I do know it provides them with a great opportunity uh, to exploit an advantage over Western democracies. And I see them using this tool increasingly in that gray space in order to, and it also gives them the added benefit of being able to deny responsibility for it because of the anonymity associated with it.
Yeah, and I think it'd be it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the U.S. government has responded to this kind of the escalation that wasn't the one we expected, right? Like we planned for the sort of hard penetration of electric grid, but then U.S. Cyber Command conducts an operation to kick the Internet Research Agency offline in advance of the 2018 election, saying we know you're going to meddle again, so we're going to push back and we're going to conduct this kind of operation. How do you see the evolution of Cyber Command's doctrine from a counteroffense standpoint unfolding right now?
Yeah, Jonathan, you remember back when we were in the Pentagon, there was a tremendous desire to adhere to restraint because we recognize that we and many of our partners and allies around the world live in glass houses where our own ducks are not in order when it comes to our posture for various reasons, including critical infrastructure, including key government functions. Um, and because of that, even though the US and our partners and allies have tremendous capabilities in this arena from an offensive perspective, we chose to be very, very constrained in how we employed those. And I think what we've recognized because of this dynamic over time, that's not where the fight is, not on the kinetic battlefield anymore. The fight is in the gray space. That's where the advantage is being won or lost. And I think as a result of seeing that, the posture now, if you look at the DoD posture, for example, in cyber, it's one of defend forward and persistent engagement. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're warmongering. It means that we're not. I would assume we're not going after things like critical infrastructure and key military capabilities. We're throwing sand in the gear of those adversaries who are employing these information warfare capabilities to take an advantage of Western democracy. So, their people, their infrastructure, their tools, their research and development. Um, that is where I think we are postured to continually watch and try to prevent something before it impacts us. And it's something that has catastrophic consequences in the US or with one of our key allies.
There are questions here about the use of offensive weapons, but I think for our purposes, one of the other good developments that I've seen since we left the policy space in 2015 is in fact the adoption of zero trust, and really the focus. You've seen MITRE ATT&CK, which was published that year. It was previously the sort of the Lockheed Martin kill chain was what we'd been briefed on at that point, was this public discussion of like, what is the adversary doing? And there was this adoption between the intelligence community and Lockheed at that time to map out the attack chain. But in 2015, we saw MITRE ATT&CK get published. It's for the first time. I consider it like a periodic table of threat behaviors, and the defender can now talk about what the adversary is doing and how they're operating, which gives defenders an advantage, right? The work that y'all have done at Palo Alto and your intelligence unit has been transformative for communicating with the public. But then we've also seen this adoption of zero trust accelerated by the SolarWinds attack, which was very much an articulation of lateral movement, right? The initial mode of compromise is this brilliant maneuver where they co-opted SolarWinds, and then they send this injection through in a Trojan horse update that then allows the malware to be distributed across hundreds of thousands of victims. But then once the malware is out, they move laterally, the intruder moves laterally throughout the environment to gain access to what they want. So I think it'd be interesting to talk for a minute about the evolution of defense as you've seen it over the last 7 years as well.
Yeah, I would say that, in putting this in the context of zero trust, we used to trust the fact that if we had a strong perimeter, we could keep everything out. And that doesn't work. The enterprise environments today are too complex. What used to be fairly simple, physical systems, on-premises systems, and static, that's all changed. And we've gone from physical to virtual. We've gone from on-prem to cloud of all types, public, private, hybrid, multi-cloud, SaaS. And we've gone from static to mobile of all kinds, including IoT. And even 5G is really going to blow that out of the water as well. So you can't, at Palo Alto Networks, zero trust is really, it's a strategic approach to cybersecurity that, secures an organization by eliminating that implicit trust about a perimeter approach, and that you can keep bad things out, and instead continuously validating every stage of a digital interaction. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. Can you describe a little bit, like, what are the components in your mind that you see within a zero trust security stack?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the published zero trust frameworks, NIST, the Department of Commerce NIST, MITRE is a big one, and other major vendors, even the U.S. DoD. I think all these sources of the definition of zero trust uncover a small common set of 3 guidelines that I think align directly with what I just described as our view at Palo Alto Networks. Number 1, validate users and verify device integrity. So any request that it's got to be authenticated and authorized to verify identity before granting access. Number 2, you have to secure the access and enforce least privileged user and device access to the data and applications. Users should only have access to the minimal amount of resources that they need to conduct their activity. And even after authenticating and checking for a clean device, least privilege access has got to still be ensured throughout the entire digital transaction. And then finally, 3, you got to have secured. You have to secure those transactions and prevent threats and protect your data. To prevent malicious activity, all the content exchanged has got to be continuously inspected to verify that it's legitimate, safe, and secure, and the transactions have to be fully examined to prevent data loss and attacks on the organization through malicious activity.
Let me ask you this, guys. So, gentlemen, one question or one thing we have been asked by different CISOs, especially who had just transitioned from IT to security world, where is zero trust a defensive strategy or offensive? And the way my view is, and I want to take your opinion on it as well, where zero trust, yes, that's more like defensive. That's where you want to know where your intellectual property crown jewels, and you want to put those controls around it, just the 3 pillars you just explained. And MITRE ATT&CK framework is something what I consider as offensive security, where now you can go in and look at what you said, Jonathan, periodic table, and all the tactics and techniques and procedures what a APT group or any known adversary will be doing. Not everybody is launching everything zero day. they also have to use some of the known techniques and tools as well. So in my way, in my opinion, in my mind, I see MITRE attack framework gives you where your gaps are by doing those recursive controls, checking and continuous validation of your controls. Zero trust ensures that the detection and prevention if something happens and when something happens.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I mean, so we published a strategy last year called, validated zero trust with MITRE attack, and I think there's two parts of it. One is, if you look at the federal government in advance of the SolarWinds intrusion, if they'd run scenarios using MITRE attack focusing on lateral movement, they would have discovered that they had massive gaps, right? So that's like, let's use the MITRE attack framework to find the holes in our armor, right? So that's one part of it. As you're building your strategy, to say, what is my most important data? And we'll get into this, I think, a little later when we talk about boards and the board environment. But what is my most important data, and have I assigned defense capabilities to defend that data, and are they working? Right now, the second thing is, if you're following a zero trust strategy, and to my mind, there's sort of three components at the defensive layer: the EDR or XDR, next generation firewalls, and micro segmentation capability. If you've adopted those three, you've really adopted best in class defense capabilities, but you then have to make sure that they're working, and you have to do it constantly, right? If you want to make sure that if you're a law firm, for example, and you have a document management system, and you've got EDR, next gen firewall, and microsegmentation around the components of your applications and your infrastructure, to say, my document management system is what I'm trying to secure. You want to run tests against it hourly, weekly, monthly, and you want to be able to measure your performance. And for John, who comes out of the special operations community, the military is constantly training. And what I like to say for the civilians who run cyber defense sectors is, you need to adopt a military mindset and say, am I exercising and training to actually make sure that I can perform when I'm ready? What is the state of your readiness, your operational readiness?
If in back to your question about defensive versus offensive, this is how I look at it. Zero trust is really moving from a static defense to an active or a dynamic defense. That's the way I look at it. And like Jonathan, let's try this analogy on, see if it makes sense to you. If you go from the information highway to the physical highway, think of the difference between safe or secure driving between a static checklist approach, annual vehicle inspection, having a driver's license, regulating vehicles with tags from different states, having road signs up, having speed limits posted, having lane markings, traffic cameras, having all that stuff in place versus the dynamic process of actually driving a vehicle in real time and paying attention to each and every physical transaction as they occur. Road construction, surprising obstacles, pedestrian behavior, dangerous or erratic driving, those type of things. Well, which one of those is going to result in a safer, more secure driving experience? Sure, the static checklist is helpful with the basic standards, but if you're not managing the dynamic risks and threats by continuously validating every stage of the physical interaction experience associated with the driving process, like zero trust approach validates every stage of a digital transaction, there's no guarantee that your driving outcome is going to be safe and secure. So that's how I would look at it.
John, you've actually, I think the analogy makes a good case for autonomous driving too, right? Or autonomous systems, because in one of the things in defense is, if you're relying entirely on the team to manage every part of your cybersecurity, then they're going to miss things. But if you bake things into the process, as zero trust does, as like the best next generation firewall or microsegmentation does, it's doing the work in the background absent your requirements.
I knew you were going to bring that up, and I was prepared for it because you're absolutely right. The self-driving vehicles leverage automation and advanced software analytics to do things faster and at a greater scale and more safely and securely than human beings can do. If you look at the cyber threat, you cannot keep pace with the scale and speed of the automated cyber threats that we face today by leveraging human decision making and manual response. You can't do it. It's just not going to work. Sure, there's still a place for people a very important place for the human aspect of cybersecurity, with things like Victor was talking about with hunting and deep analytics and engineering skills and those type of things. But the old, level one SOC analyst capabilities, you can totally automate those today, and we should be.
John, given your leadership experience, I think it would be really helpful to talk about lessons we've learned from the tragic conflict in Ukraine and our assessments of the cyber aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war and lessons learned so far.
I think a lot of people, both former colleagues in the military and government, as well as across the industry landscape, I don't think there have been very many surprises about what happened in the lead up to the 24th of February, when Russia invaded Ukraine in the traditional sense. I think that everybody kind of expected that there would be extensive use of cyber uh, in order to kind of set the stage for traditional combat operations. But I think a lot of people, especially in industry, have come up to me and said, why haven't we seen more in terms of volume and level of impact from Russian cyber operations after the 24th of February? So I'll give you what I think are four, four reasons why we're not seeing what many thought we were going to see. And these could be in combination. And obviously, I'm not talking about anything that's classified. So this is just my observation based on past experience, as well as what our Unit 42 threat intelligence has been able to monitor from the situation. First reason, I don't think cyber has been an important or effective as an option for Russia after the 24th of February. I think that while cyber operations provide our adversaries with that broad range of options in the gray space, short of traditional armed conflict that I was talking about, I think that range of options becomes much more narrow once the threshold has been crossed. Once kinetic operations begin, why are you going to rely on something where the probability of success or precise impact is less certain, and the effects may take an undetermined amount of time, when you can bomb it or shoot it with much more certainty in terms of both timing and impact? And there's also likely quite a bit more going on in the cyber realm than we may realize. Simply hasn't risen to the level, at least publicly, that I think many had expected. We know that Russia, both directly and by inspiring or ignoring third parties, has attempted to target and achieve some limited temporary successes against Ukrainian national and military command and control, media, the energy sector, other critical infrastructure targets. I think at my last count, there have been at least 7 different wiper destructive data capabilities, cyber capabilities that Russia or its surrogates have unleashed on Ukraine that, occurred after the 24th of February. And in some cases, we've even seen Russia or its surrogates target some of the Baltic states that neighbor Ukraine and Russia. Therefore, I don't think it's not like Russia has jettisoned its use of cyber capabilities after crossing the traditional threshold of armed conflict. They're just not likely assessed by Russian decision makers as being as useful, and therefore they're not employed on the same scale as before the beginning of armed conflict. That could all change if things continue to go south, and they could scale them back up if need be. But I think that's the first reason. Second reason, I think, is Russia quickly became a tougher cyber target by becoming less vulnerable and more resilient to cyber attacks. There was a lot of rapid improvement in Ukrainian cyber defenses and steady sustainment, both immediately prior to and since the initial surge following the 24th of February. And I think that this has been something that it's made it more difficult for Russian cyber operations to be effective. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, but among the most impactful, I think, has been the surge of support in the form of defensive cyber operations capabilities from the U.S. and partner nation, including cybersecurity industry organizations, to Ukrainian authorities, as well as the sharing of cyber threat intelligence from the U.S. and its allies and their commercial entities as well to those same Ukrainian authorities. One of the lessons we've learned, though, is that that was initially a problem for Ukraine because of their data sovereignty laws. So they were not allowed to store stuff in the public cloud. And that made the sharing of global insights as well as the sharing of capabilities that would leverage the cloud impossible. So I think the Ukrainian digital minister worked with parliament and they changed the law so that they were able to share that data in publicly available clouds for the purposes of cybersecurity. And that made that made them a whole lot more resilient and preventative in terms of what the Russians were trying to do. Third reason, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but as I mentioned before, I think some monkey wrenches are being thrown into the Russian cyber operations gears. Um, I don't have a high degree of confidence in that, but I suspect that with an approach that is forward leaning like we have, that once again, I'm not suggesting we're talking about holding Russian critical infrastructure at risk or doing anything escalatory or outside the law of armed conflict, even though NATO's not in conflict with Russia. I am suggesting that the US and the rest of the West, uh, um, even though we have a long way to go to get to the type of cyber defensive posture that we need, guess whose cyber defenses are worse than ours? Our adversaries. And so I think that, I think that is a factor. And then last, I don't think we've seen more cyber activity than many anticipated because Russians decision makers could be hesitant to increase the scale and impact of some of its cyber operations, considering the heightened sensitivities in an environment that might draw a more direct and kinetic engagement by NATO. So nobody knows where the red lines are, and I think that there could be some hesitancy with the use of cyber operations. And even though I don't have a lot of confidence in that one, if you look at what has been thrown at Ukraine since the 24th of February, much of that has been designed not to spread. It's been very specific and not in spread in an uncontrolled manner. And that might indicate, I think that's kind of proof that there's concern about things spilling outside and drawing in a more direct confrontation with NATO.
That's a great point. I think The Economist wrote what I thought was one of the best pieces about Putin's behavior in cyberspace, either like a week after the invasion or somewhere around that point, when the question was, why hasn't Russia conducted destructive operations against or any kind of escalatory operations against the West? And the analysis that The Economist outlined, which I think is right, is Putin does not, he wants to achieve his military objectives in Ukraine as much as he can. And thankfully he's not, obviously, for all the reasons that we can get into. But it's only when he begins to detect that he's going to not succeed at all, and he's in a stalemate kind of position, and he can't take lands anymore in the way that he wants to, would he then be on the back foot such that he might begin to escalate using cyber operations to revert to the nuisance behavior that he did before the invasion. So I continue to believe that when the Ukrainian conflict terminates, certainly hopefully on terms favorable to the Ukraine and the West, that will be when we begin to see an escalation in Russia's cyber operations against NATO targets. Again, below the level of armed conflict, because I think he still maintains some level of rational.
So, in the civilian side or private sector, when security leaders are hearing all of this, one concern had also been floating around where when these conflicts happen, obviously nation state actors are activated and they are creating and deploying and actually recruiting other hackers or tools or techniques they're creating. That does get to the point where now it's being resold for monetary purposes, which actually increases the inventory for what we need to defend against. Have you guys also seen that? Any trickle down of or increase on tools or the malwares or ransomware groups or anything like that because of the conflict?
That's a good question. I think I mean, certainly there's a lot more activity in every area going on during a conflict where there are a lot more people conducting offensive or defensive operations. across a range of capabilities inside of cyber and outside of it, where there's just a lack of, that's the fog of war, right? Like there's elements of that go on. I think, let me, if I could, before we return to that, I think one of the things that was really interesting at the outset of hostilities that I think is a big lesson learned is how the technology sector around the sanctions, as sanctions unfolded to the tune of 300 billion against the Russian central bank, you saw Google and Apple and others just immediately withdraw their capabilities, right? There was zero question about the illegitimacy of the Russian regime or the war. And that meant that people in Moscow could not board the subway using Apple Pay. They couldn't pay for things like that all of a sudden. And so as we see that, and then concurrently in cyberspace, you had large organizations. Microsoft had an article published in the New York Times that was basically a press release about its behavior in cyberspace, the information it was sharing with the West, with the U.S. government. There's this rallying of big tech to say we're going to combine against the adversary, and we're going to contribute our defensive capabilities within our terms of service, because we're not neutral. And Microsoft has come out and said we are not Switzerland. We're not a neutral actor in this. We're standing with democracy. And I think, it was obviously a couple of the other things that have happened that are massively transformative is the big increase in Germany's defense budget, countries like Finland and Sweden opting to join NATO, a real hardening of the NATO alliance against Russia, and the total isolation, and the billions and billions of dollars in material that's gone into Ukraine. But then you've got Ukrainian Resolve. We have been partnering with them since 2015 on cyber defense cooperation, since Russia began its operations after Crimea, since Russia began its operations against the electric grid in Ukraine. And that's certainly, I think, that has borne defensive fruit. And their defensive capabilities and their armaments across every area has increased tremendously, to include the drone operations that they were conducting in the early part of this week, which shows their incredible resolve. But yeah, Victor, I think we haven't yet seen there's so many different chapters of this story that are going to play out, and I think one of them certainly is the sort of proliferation of malware and where it goes and what happens. And of course, there's elements of end user agreements on the defensive side, because we now have poured all these capabilities into Ukraine. And as much as we admire Zelensky and his regime right now, history shows that over time regimes change. So that is something to be aware of.
Yep, yeah, for sure. One question I would like to both of you. What advice do we give to boards, senior business leaders, and government, military leaders, security leaders? What to prioritize when it comes to cybersecurity? When they're thinking about these things, zero trust, when they're thinking about our attack framework, when they're thinking about these strategies and forming that tactical plan, what advice would you give to them?
I think that zero trust as a concept isn't really all that complicated, but a lot of organizations struggle with implementation. And I think a lot of boards are asking, where do we start? What current controls can be leveraged? Do we have the right skill set? Do we have the right funding? How long is it going to take? Um, so that to me is why, in giving advice, I think that you tell an organization to be a zero trust enterprise, you got to take a comprehensive strategic approach to this. It's a journey. We hear that all the time, but it's got to encompass users, applications, infrastructure that spans identity, devices, workloads, access, and like I mentioned earlier, all each and every transaction throughout that digital process. But starting from the beginning, I think it can be broken down into three phases. One, visibility, and that's the discovery and asset identification. Number two, controls, security capability improvement. Um, you got to put zero trust policies and controls in place by implementing a consistent set of security capabilities with continuous validation. And then number three, plans. Zero trust strategy implementation requires that you create both short-term and long-term goals, and you design your architecture, and you continue to optimize it. So I think one of the most important aspects, though, is to start with a holistic approach that spans all the different aspects of your enterprise or information technology environment.
In my opinion, I think a lot of people are still struggling with that first step where you mentioned, which is going back to the inventory of your software, hardware, applications, what people are running, and then the next step comes controls. And then there's also aspect of culture change. Zero trust implies that we're not trusting anything anymore. And IT also had that culture about 30 years ago where we started trusting people. When we give an access, when we give people some sort of let's say feature product or something to make their life better, their job better, they should be effective at their job doing this thing, we trusted them with the right things. So now taking that away is a culture change where a lot of security leaders are struggling because business want to make sure that they focus on business. Here, security comes in and telling them that we won't be able to trust all of this, and there's another hoop. So I think that also needs to be simplified, where it's not we're not adding additional step for someone to complete their job. It still has to be transparent. If zero trust is actually stopping business to conduct their business, I think that approach is also wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think zero trust does take a level of adoption and cultural change. I think it depends on the provider. I think certainly like Palo Alto Networks has experienced this tremendous amount of success, and they're contributing to a zero trust architecture. But the levels of adoption for something like a next generation firewall or Cortex or EDR is less disruptive than other technologies that are tremendously important and successful for a zero trust architecture, but are perhaps more disruptive and require more cultural change. I think that's a very good point when it comes to, technology and product market fit. There's times when teams need to suck down more. No, I believe actually that it's okay for business to be for business leaders to take a bit of a hit in terms of their operations. Like we've learned from the scale of the attacks that we have to we have to spend money if we're gonna be safe and secure, because it's going to get worse and worse and worse. There's the narrative that it should be cybersecurity should be at least 10% of your IT budget. I think that's certainly true, and then I believe you have to have another 10% on top for to be able to make sure that things work. So, to my point on boards, I think one of the things that I like to say is we have if you're a CISO or a security leader, you have all these defense capabilities. You need to make sure that they work, whether it's your DLP, your firewall, email filtering, whatever it is. There's capabilities that you're going to have on day one. It's very rare when you're a CISO, you start and there's no investments. That's great. You can then do whatever you want. But you're going to have all these technologies from day one. You have legacy capabilities. And what we found in our research is that EDR capabilities only perform at 39% effectiveness in customer environments. So even if you have the world's most advanced EDR capabilities, they work perfectly well in a lab. When they get deployed into a customer environment against top techniques, they're degraded. Now, 39% means that's good. They're stopping 40% of the tactics and techniques, but the intruder can still do other things. So you have to have that level of investment to make sure that it's all working. And you can use MITRE ATT&CK to do it. You should focus on key threats to your sector and look at the kinds of behaviors that are happening over and over again. I think from a zero trust standpoint, the other thing I would say to a board is focus on your high value assets, and that means going from your mission and what's your core mission. And I like this example of a law firm because I think a lot of people don't think about law firms that much. Is you have a document management system that protects your client's data. So that's your key mission, is to have your client data. So you got to focus on what matters most, your high value assets, and put your defense capabilities around it. Too few people, I think, adopt a one size fits all approach for adopting cybersecurity. But if you focus on your key applications first and really your most important things, and you've made a lot of progress. If you're the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, which John and I both were affected by and know all too well, then that's the data about U.S. government employees. That database should have the defenses really, really circled around it. And then I think you have to exercise continuously and test and prepare for disruption. And those three things, like align to threats that matter most, defend your high value assets, and exercise and train. Those are simple to say, but harder to do. And you just have to put them up on your computer screen and get after it every day. And you should be able to say at the end of each workday, have I made progress in achieving one of these three things in some way?
Yeah, Jonathan, just playing off of your high value assets approach in terms of prioritization. If you recall, back when I was at U.S. Cyber Command as the director of current operations, the term we used was cyber key terrain. So, step one in figuring out a smart approach was figuring out exactly what you said. Those most important systems, networks, data, and even the people that are responsible for and run them, and prioritizing your resources around those. So I would absolutely agree with that. The only thing I would add, though, is that, and you made me think of this, Jonathan, when you were talking about the training. In advising boards, often we tell them these are some of the questions that you should come to terms with at a very high level. And it's, how often should board members be meeting with their CISO? What should the board's role be during a cybersecurity incident? You just talked about that one. How should board members evaluate whether the company is sufficiently investing in cybersecurity? What kind of detail should board members understand about the overall cybersecurity program in that organization? Um, what level of detail should board members expect from regular risk assessments? And how should cybersecurity be integrated into more comprehensive risk updates to the board? And finally, how should governments incentivize companies to have board members that are informed on cybersecurity risks? I think if boards can come to terms, and it'll be different for every organization, if they can come to terms with those kinds of questions, I think that they will be in a much better position uh, to do this very effectively.
I think the last thing I would say in terms of focusing, those are all exactly the right questions, right? Like there's no doubt about those questions. Um, I like to focus. I use my Fitbit every day. I wake up and I see how well I slept, and I watch my resting heart rate pretty carefully because those are like easy and cheap measurements of my health effectiveness. During the pandemic, the data got very distressing. I will admit, because I was sitting around a lot. Now, for boards, I like to say, your company's making all these investments. If you're a board of a major global financial organization, you probably have potentially tens of millions of dollars, if not $100 million in defense investments that are ongoing, and you want to know that they're working. So you want to look for outcomes. So if I'm Congress right now, and this is an example I like to use, I would call up the executive branch and say, okay, you said you've launched the zero trust strategy. It's been a year and a half. Prove to me that it's working. Show me that you're ready for a SolarWinds type intrusion, and prove to me that you would stop it. And you want to say, like, look, last month we were at 50, last year we were at 50% effectiveness. Now we're like 3 months ago 75. And Senator, I'm glad to report that we are now at 95% effectiveness against this intrusion. That's the kind of thing that a board can look out for, I think. I don't know if you've seen that behavior, John, in boards, but I've certainly seen it in the market.
Yes, and I think you're right. Focusing on outcomes and trying to put metrics where it's possible to put metrics. I think that's a very effective way of measuring progress.
Yeah, real ones. Because it's easy to be like, I've patched all these things. This chiclet chart looks great. I'm in compliance with NIST 800-53, but I actually want to know how you're going to perform against the Russians today or tomorrow, given their techniques.
The analogy in the military would be measure of performance instead of measure of effectiveness. Measure of performance is just, measuring the task that you're doing, not what the outcome is. So, measure of effectiveness, which is much more difficult, by the way, I mean, you got to put some thought into what success looks like and how the metrics would describe that in order to be able to measure it effectively. And sometimes you start measuring the wrong things as well. So, I mean, there has to be some uh, learning and adjustment as you go forward. But I think you're absolutely right.
Well, in my view, that's a great spot for me to stop at, Victor. Over to you.
These are all great insights. I think our CISOs and security leaders will love to hear more from both of you. But for this session, we'll wrap here. Again, this was very insightful, and thank you both of you for being on the show and speaking to our CISOs. Thank you very much.
Sure. Actually, I should say before you sign off, John, do you have any final thoughts? I want to hand the mic back to you really quickly, if you don't mind, Victor.
No, go for it.
No, I just appreciate the opportunity. And for all those listening out there, you have tough jobs. I wish all of you the very best of success. I know you're all taking it seriously. I know that life can be tough sometimes. I mean, the battle rhythm, as we would call it in the military, can be quite grinding, but I really appreciate what you're doing. I think that what you're doing is serving on the front lines in the modern age, the modern digital age. So my hat's off to you. And I hope you all have a great holiday season.
What a great message.
Wonderful.